Hello, I'm Shihoko Goto, the director of the Indo-Pacific program here at the Wilson Center, and it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you to today's discussion. In particular, I want to welcome Michael Davis, who is a global fellow here at the center. He is also a professor of law and international affairs at Jindal Global University and a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University. Michael, congratulations on your book, Freedom Undone, The Assault on Liberal Values and Institutions in Hong Kong. We're going to spend today talking about his book, and joining him in this conversation will be Kellee Tsai, Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern University, and also Robert Daly, my colleague, the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center. So first of all, Michael, this book focuses in detail on the run-up to and the consequences of China imposing a national security law upon Hong Kong in 2020. And as a scholar of constitutional law who has spent decades in Hong Kong, my question to you simply is, why this book and why now?
Oh, well, that's a good question. This is the book. I don't know if it shows up to our viewers. It was kind of a compulsion for me because I literally spent 30 years in the midst of this debate, from the handover all the way forward to today. I was a public intellectual in Hong Kong and commonly on the media and regular on RTHK's Today, Hong Kong Today, and all of this. So I was kind of engaged very much, and I felt like I had to write the book. I sometimes say when I give a book talk that the book is actually sort of written by Hong Kong people, and I'm the chronicler of the book. I'm pulling it together and providing analysis. So the book does cover all the protests and so on over time, and the government's reaction and various bills and activities that cause more protest and so on. And I did have a front row seat in most of this, and on the street and in the legislative council and in academia. So yeah, I had to write the book. I think what I want to achieve with it are two things. One is I want to highlight sort of what China's doing there. And so the book goes into, in the very first chapter, China's national security policies. I mean, people probably want to understand why 45 people just a couple weeks ago are sentenced to long terms in prison for being the political opposition that wanted to organize a primary election. So what is this security agenda that China has in Hong Kong? What does it do? Why is it doing this? Why is it changing things so radically? And so in the beginning of the book, after some introduction, I highlight this. And I often like to use a quote from Chow Hong Tong, who's now in prison under the national security law, awaiting trial. And she says a lot. She wrote a letter from prison because she was given a human rights award, and wrote her response speech in prison, I guess by hand, since they're not given tools otherwise. And one little short sentence says, "What happened in Hong Kong is not an anomaly, but a warning." And I think that's kind of the spirit of the book. Some people might say, well, Hong Kong is lost already, give it up. But that's not what we do in the human rights business. When things look bad, that's when we speak and we expose, and that's the job. And then I'm sure Robert's going to ask me about, well, what do we do next? But we'll get to that later. The book focuses really on Hong Kong. And so on China's national security agenda, I highlight in 2012, they start out by issuing a document that wasn't supposed to go public that essentially forbids the teaching of constitutionalism, forbids teaching free speech, and Western notions of democracy and constitutionalism. So it's kind of trying to tell academics not to promote liberal ideas, because those are the things that are prohibited in this document. Then along comes Xi Jinping in 2013 and 2014. There's a comprehensive national security concept introduced as law in China. And what it does is it seems to view the Chinese people as the chief threat to national security in the country. And so it identifies something like 16 different areas of areas where threats to national security might exist, which is practically everything that happens in society. So it's what they call a comprehensive national security concept. And the target, again, is liberal ideas and liberal values that are considered detrimental to the spirit of the nation and so on. And this causes them to introduce more patriotic education and engage in a kind of party penetration of society. So the idea is this kind of holistic concept to shut up people, and you want to know what they're going after, and what becomes evident when you look up close. It is the liberal ideas. They're viewed as an existential threat in China. And so if the people acquire them, then they become the problem for the party. So the national security agenda, of course, is a party security agenda to keep those people in power. So this is kind of what China's doing. And what I argue in the book, they essentially import into Hong Kong. So in doing so, the mechanism, as you mentioned in the introduction, is this national security law. Okay. Now, one might ask, well, what is it doing? I argue in the book that it's overthrowing the liberal constitutional order that's promised Hong Kong and that was actually in place in Hong Kong for the most part, not full democracy, but the rest of it, judicial review, very well protected freedom of expression and so on. For those not familiar with Hong Kong, this was included in a Sino-British Joint Declaration, a treaty to return Hong Kong. And some people would say, well, China, the Communist Party, couldn't have intended any kind of liberal ideas or values. Well, they didn't. They shouldn't have written it down so clearly. It's very much in there. If you look at the rights guarantees in the Sino-British Treaty that are then moved to the basic law of Hong Kong, 16 rights, 8 of them are free speech in one form or another. Okay. So it's very clear case. They guarantee the maintenance of the common law system and the rule of law, and they use and then guarantee the treaties that applied to Hong Kong, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and so on. All of these things add up, and Hong Kong people understood them to add up to a liberal order in Hong Kong. And now over the years, so the book goes through these protests and reactions and so on over the years. When they see a kind of erosion of these things, people start pushing back, especially on the issue of democracy, because they quickly concluded that the government appointed by Beijing, and is complicated, there's a legislature that's elected, but part of it, most of it, is guaranteed in effect to be in the pro-Beijing camp. And the chief executive is appointed by Beijing, selected by a committee designed to deliver someone who's in the pro-Beijing camp. So they're reacting to things. They view this government as unable to guard Hong Kong's promised high degree of autonomy. And so whenever there's a kind of erosion through various Beijing actions or Hong Kong official actions, they start pushing back. After the handover, the first major protest was when Hong Kong government was going to enact a national security law under something called Article 23. So they pushed back then, 500,000 people on the street. I was actually one of the academics and lawyers, leading lawyers, who was the core of the Article 23 concern group. There were 9 of us. We wrote a bunch of pamphlets, distributed them on the street, about 500,000 pamphlets, and we wound up with about 500,000 protesters. So this is kind of the dialogue between the government and the people, and a distrust that the government will defend the people's rights, so continuous demands for democracy. So the book goes through several stages of that. I'll jump into the national security law, which I argue, in a sense, overthrows the constitutional order in Hong Kong. I can't get into it in really detail because of the time, so just highlight a few things I kind of jotted down as sort of bullet points. The law was imposed on Hong Kong unseen. Even the chief executive of Hong Kong claimed she didn't see it until the day it was imposed on June 30th, 2020. It's superior to all local laws. So it effectively became an amendment to the Basic Law without following the procedures in the Basic Law for amendment. It's a national law. So the courts in Hong Kong do not have the power of constitutional review over the law, which is the power to, to rule that some laws are invalid if they violate the rights guarantees in the Basic Law. Well, the court can't hold it up against the Basic Law and throw out any of the national security law, because most of it violates the Basic Law. So they can't do that. In fact, if a case that finally came up there, the highest court in Hong Kong said it can't do that. It's sort of, so it became a fundamental, wherever there's a conflict between the national security law and this liberal Basic Law, then the national security law wins out. Okay, it changed the process dramatically. It took away the right to a jury for criminal defendants in these national security cases, not just cases under that law, but any case that's branded a national security case, even if under another law. Okay, so there's no right to a jury. The very first case came up, the court essentially held there's a presumption against bail, which is also a common law kind of right. So all of these things are degrading the system. And then it creates a committee to safeguard national security, chaired by the chief executive, but under the Central People's Government and supervised advised, they say, by a mainland official. So in effect, this committee operates in secret and it's not subject to judicial review, again, undermining the rule of law element. And not only there, it creates another, I guess you call it an office for safeguarding national security that is staffed by mainland public security people and so on. All of this sort of comes together to create now this kind of secret police in Hong Kong. They create a special unit for national security, and they even create a special prosecutorial unit. And then they designate the judges that can hear national security, only the ones that's trusted, because Beijing never trusted the Hong Kong judges who were exercising constitutional review under the Basic Law. So all of this is really sort of changing fundamentally the order in the city. And what happens is it winds up also targeting and regulating education. I know Kellee will be interested in that. And I wrote a big, long section in the book about how they're trying to regulate educational system through new guidelines and all of that. They regulate the public broadcaster that I used to speak on. I have not gotten any more invitations to speak there since. So they really went after the whole system. They intimidated, sort of a Hong Kong version of inviting for tea, the officials, and kind of intimidating all the organizations that were pro-democracy or critical of the government. So they all wound up and closed down. They arrested these prominent people, as I said, the 45 in the opposition. All the opposition is effectively in jail or in exile. Jimmy Lai, of course, is on trial as we speak. So they intimidated the media. Now, they say this only reaches a few people, but everybody got the memo. They know to keep their mouth shut and stay out of the way. So the academia that I was in, which was very vibrant, me and my colleagues were constantly asked to speak on public issues and so on. It's gone silent. So that's what's happened. Then I can just give a couple more points. One is they changed the electoral system. It used to be half of the legislature could be directly elected by the people. They cut that back. They increased the size of the legislature. And then they created a vetting system that guaranteed that no opposition would be approved. The police, if you want to run for legislature or even for the district council, they will have the police investigate you. They'll have a vetting committee look at you and an election committee look at you. By the time that's all done, when they held the next legislative election, there was no opposition. They changed the way the chief executive was chosen. again, through this election committee, by changing the makeup of the election committee to more securely guarantee opposition would not be able to participate. So the last election for John Lee, the chief executive, had no opposing candidates. It was an election of one man only. They were even on the legislature, they even tried to beg candidates to find someone acceptable to oppose them so they can feign it's an election. So this is really destroyed confidence in the system. And then finally, that Article 23 legislation was finally passed. I don't want to go into it in detail like I did with the national security law, but only want to note that what they finally came up with, before they actually had the legislation, they had a consultation document. In that document, the first two chapters admire at length the comprehensive national security system on the mainland and say that Hong Kong is going to adopt a holistic approach like the mainland. And it's interesting because if you had any doubt that the national security law fully imported the mainland national security regime, then that doubt is erased because they wholeheartedly embrace it. And they speak critically of people, they say, under the guises of fighting for human rights or monitoring human rights. They're in effect not true. These are guises that these things they're doing. So this is what's going on. This is just the broad picture, but I think enough for our discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Michael, for that overview. And what was very striking about your book, coming from a constitutional scholar, an analysis, a deep dive into the legal, the shifts in the legal framework is to be expected. But of course, you are also, if I may call you that, an activist as well. And you take a great deal of time and I think passion into analyzing how these changes affected and impacted Hong Kong society and the identity of the people of the city as well. And so that has really come through tremendously from your work. And I want to turn now to Kellee. Of course, you're now at Northeastern, but until recently you were at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Your background is, you're very much focused on the political economy of China. From that perspective and your own personal experience being based in Hong Kong, I'm wondering if you could share some of your feedback about Michael's work.
Sure, absolutely. Well, before Hong Kong, I was at Hopkins, and I must say it's wonderful to be on the same panel with Robert Daly, who's the American co-director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center when I was on the faculty at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And what an incredible privilege to have the opportunity to engage with Michael Davis's recently published book. There aren't many or really any legal scholars who have lived and taught in Hong Kong for so many decades who've been able to provide a comprehensive overview of how Hong Kong's constitutional order has evolved in practice, both before and after the 1997 handover. And in so doing, Michael, you have perhaps incurred risk to your personal safety, though I assume you're not planning to return to Hong Kong anytime soon. As I read the book, it was striking how many people in Hong Kong's quest for democracy have been colleagues of yours, either directly or indirectly. And on a more personal note, the book's systematic tracing of liberal backsliding into full-on authoritarianism very much captures many of the reasons why my family and I returned to the US this year after living and working in Hong Kong for over a decade. When we arrived in 2013, it was right after the national education protests and right on the eve of Occupy Central. What I really appreciated about this book is that it's accessible not only to readers like myself, a political scientist who lived in Hong Kong, but also people who aren't as familiar with the history of the pre-handover context and the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong, which allowed for Hong Kong's return to China while preserving rule of law and protection of human rights. I also appreciated your analysis of the 1990 Basic Law, which serves as Hong Kong's de facto constitution. And I noted the book was careful to point out that after the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests in China, the Basic Law on a certain level was meant to signal to foreign investors that the rule of law, common law tradition would be maintained in Hong Kong. But the book also carefully points out that the Basic Law also included the word turmoil in Article 18 that could provide a basis for mainland intervention. And the Basic Law also bolstered Article 23, providing the basis for national security legislation later on. So understanding this historical, political, and legal context in the first 3 books of the chapter really sets the stage well for the next 7 substantive chapters of the book that take us through significant protests, culminating in the enactment of the national security law in June 2020. As the book describes the progression of increasing encroachment on the autonomy side of the Basic Law, the overall tone also has a slight sense of inevitability, but I'm not sure if that was intended and would like to engage you a bit on that point. To what extent were there critical junctures during which the Hong Kong government could have made different decisions and possibly provided greater assurances to Beijing that things were actually under control in Hong Kong and not a genuine threat to national security? And before you answer that, I'll just note for the audience who may not be quite as familiar with the March of Protests, the book does discuss 4 really significant moments of societal mobilization in reaction to proposed legislation. So there were the 2003 protests against the provision in Article 23 of the Basic Law that the Hong Kong SAR government would enact national security legislation. 500,000 people took to the streets. The bill was withdrawn. Then in 2012, the protests against a proposal for patriotic education mobilized youth who would then go on to participate in a 3rd major episode, the umbrella movement in the fall of 2014, growing out of the Occupy Central protests that summer, after the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress issued a white paper saying that limiting access to the nomination process for the chief executive in a way that circumscribed the principle of universal suffrage. And then finally, the 4th and final, the 2019 anti-extradition bill protests that escalated to a much broader swath of the population with 2 million people on the streets at its peak. And then we know the national security law was enacted in June of 2020. So to what extent were there missed opportunities for the Hong Kong government to show that it had things under control and could manage what Beijing would perceive as turmoil on the streets?
Michael, I'm going to have to ask you to unmute.
I was asking, could you hear me? Thank you. So I'm following instructions so well that I mute myself. Any case, yeah, we had this conversation actually when I recently did a book talk at Harvard. Was there an opportunity to avoid all this? And I think if there was, it had to be early on. My feeling over the many years, and I know a lot of the people in government, I spent several meetings with Regina Ip, who's very prominent in the government to this day. But my feeling was that these officials never really conveyed well to Beijing anything about how this society functions and why if Beijing wants to maintain an open society, which Hong Kong was, it had a very broad openness to the world and all kinds of competing press and everything. What was needed and how to live with that. And Beijing officials have no experience running an open society. So if there was any opportunity, and I have to hedge this, and I'll tell you why, but if there was any opportunity to sort of take a different path, I think it depended on officials finding a way to, number one, because very early on, they started dragging their heels on the promised democratic reform and talking about language such as gradual and orderly progress, which everyone in Hong Kong understood meant no progress, excuse me. And that essentially sealed the deal. They're already dragging their heels on doing what's promised. And then officials are not, they're in effect joining the chorus of Beijing officials to criticize protesters instead of trying to help Beijing understand that these things were just part of an open society. Hong Kong's protest all of these, and I just, as I really appreciate Kelly's overview of them. I felt in my little 15 minutes I had to give the architecture. So I appreciate you now drilling into these events. But, you know, Hong Kong people's protests were always nonviolent. Even the later ones, 2014 protests with Benny Tai, who's now been sentenced to 10 years in jail just a few weeks ago. He actually conducted a whole year-long training for students in nonviolence. So there was no real threat, except the more pressure was put on it, and the failure to listen to the people meant that the younger generation that came along in 2019 sort of said, "You taught us." They wrote this on the wall of the Legislative Council when they occupied it. "You taught us nonviolence doesn't work." You know, so I think there was a way to do it, but it required officials to find their voice, not to fight with Beijing, because they're not going to win that fight, but to help Beijing to understand what's going on. My hedge, I don't know even this would work with Xi Jinping, because he's kind of a hardliner on speed. And so some people would argue that, well, Xi Jinping, he's cracking down in the mainland severely with those national security laws I just described, and he's using them. Would he continue with that more liberal model? Because if the Hong Kong officials had argued to go forward according to the promises made, by the time Xi Jinping took power, there would probably be a Democratic chosen chief executive in Hong Kong. You know, instead of dragging their heels, they probably would have been expected to progress normally towards that. If not then soon after. And in fact, they even kind of suggested they would try it in 2017, but that failed. And they made that announcement in 2014 after dragging heels for a long time, almost 2 decades. So this is, I think, if there was that opportunity, it was for officials to defend the roadmap that was put in place in the Basic Law early on. And then I think for the national security law, for example, I was part of the opposition to that, leading that opposition. And, you know, the thing is, if that national security law they proposed simply conformed to the ICCPR and international standards for national security regulation, then the opposition would disappear. I remember being called in by the Secretary for Security. I thought I was going to have an opportunity to talk to her. She's Regina Ip, being called into her office during our protest in 2003, and I didn't get to speak. She just gave me a lecture on why we're violating all her requirements and everything, and, you know, trying to tell us to shut up. So this was a one-on-one. So there just was no willingness to go forward with the model they designed. And I quite frankly don't think the model was a threat to China. I think in a way, a democratically elected government could not afford in Hong Kong, and I don't think Hong Kong people would elect a politician that was going to go after the central government. That they want somebody who can represent them reasonably well, but they're not, you know, stupid. They know that you can't, Hong Kong cannot just be full on at war with the central government. That wouldn't work. So I think that there were opportunities, but none of them were seized.
I'd like to follow up on that a bit, because I understand that the central thesis of your book is that the national security law represents a progression of a long pattern of increased intervention and distrust that goes back to the 80s, like even before the handover. But from the perspective of someone who was living through all of that, especially 2019, I was surrounded by people who felt tremendous frustration that Carrie Lam was not listening to the people about the anti-extradition bill. And the perception on the ground was that she was stubbornly insisting on it, even though it was so clear that it was problematic, even to large parts of Hong Kong's business community and tycoon community. And in the end, that extradition bill was withdrawn. It didn't even go through. So I just wonder, you know, was there something, was it her stubbornness as an individual leader, or was it really that Beijing was absolutely insisting on it?
I think the latter. I think she's a career civil servant and was used to always doing what she's told. And some politicians or civil servants who wouldn't want to do what they were told would probably leave the government, wouldn't be picked for that job. The current leader, John Lee, of course, the policeman who was carrying out those orders to suppress the protesters in 2019. So I think that's what happened. And like I said, she did not find her voice to push back. And she drug her heels to the bloody end on all of that. And she had experience with dragging her heels because she did that in 2014 when she was chief secretary, and she was in charge of mediating with the student activist and basically gave no ground. So no doubt why she got the job afterwards and became the chief executive. So I think that was, you're seeing on the tail end something I saw all the way back to the first chief executive, Tong Chihua. It's just a constant story. And I think Beijing gave a little room early on, but these officials just didn't know how to seize it. But by the time we got to Carrie Lam in 2019, the rumors were that somebody was across the border in Shenzhen telling the Hong Kong government everything to do. In 2019, clearly the police seemed to be taking guidance from, because I'd been in many protests in Hong Kong, and I remember some of the earlier ones in the 80s or 90s, I guess it was, the police could almost be handing out roses as you marched 1 million people in 1989. I guess it was the 80s. They were so nice and polite, and all the protests went up the Happy Valley Raceway, and everybody, was kumbaya. It was just really the police that we saw in 2019 were a completely different story. And I think that's kind of, Beijing is in charge of that. And how and when, that's all opaque.
Thank you. So that brings me to bring Robert into the conversation. We've had a great deal of discussion about what could have been. I think one of the things that I would be interested in hearing from you is about, what your takeaway from Michael's book is, and what, how he can set the stage for what could be for Hong Kong in the future, and its implications perhaps for US-China relations more broadly. What is your takeaway?
Let me ask, Michael's raised a whole bunch of questions. I want to ask one that's somewhat backward looking, and then one that looks more forward. And this is related to Kelly's question about inevitability. My question is more of a historical hypothetical. In 97, Hong Kong became a special administrative region of the PRC. And from Beijing's point of view, the key word here is of, right?
Yeah.
In a possessive sense. And so clearly at 97 at the latest, Hong Kong's subsequent fate was going to be more closely tied to changes within China itself than to any sort of international changes or changes in markets. Right? And so I'd like, and you've hinted at this a little bit, but I'd like to invite you to talk about it a little bit more if you would like. If, for example, we hadn't had the advent of Xi Jinping, if we'd had a continuation roughly along the Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao trajectory, which was not an absolutely straight arrow, but there was a consistency there with the Dengist legacy. Might things have unfolded differently? In other words, Hong Kong is at 97, they're really tied to the mainland. How much of this do you see as being tied to the turn that China somewhat takes, if you see it as a turn, with Xi Jinping coming in? That's the one that looks back. And then looking forward is really the big question. And Michael, you and I used to speak about this when you were at the Wilson Center, and I think we had slightly different views. And I think it goes without saying that, we all love Hong Kong. I don't have the experience that the two of you have there, but my experience there is pretty long and deep. And just, the things that we cherish and the people that we've known and the places and the spirit, I know in my case animates my own feeling about this. But really, why should we think of it differently than any other Chinese city at this point? Do we care more about the civil liberties of the people of Hong Kong than of those of Beijing or Shanghai, all of which have their own particular stories. Even under the PRC, they have their own particular stories if you look closely enough, as does Guiyang, as does Changsha. And there's still a tendency to treat Hong Kong as somehow different, whether that is based on nostalgia or whether we think it's a cudgel America can wield. Should we treat it as different than other Chinese cities, as special at all? Or should we just say this is another Chinese city, full stop? All of the trade should be treated as part of our trade with China. What is the argument for continued special treatment of Hong Kong? Again, tragic, regrettable as all this is, looking forward, why should we see it as different? Thanks.
Okay, well, let's take your first one. You know, as you well know, one country has been at war with two systems throughout all of these years. And that's kind of the language of it. In fact, you know, Hong Kong people fighting for two systems and China for one country. And to mediate that difference is the problem we discussed a minute ago, of course, with Kellee, is that, you know, probably the mediator had to be those officials in Hong Kong willing to sort of, because they were charged with guarding a high degree of autonomy, which they didn't guard very effectively. And I think because there was a system of rewards for speaking out in Beijing's way, just like maybe US politicians expect their followers to speak out to agree with them on things. So I think this is the problem. I think that's why I had this hedge. I think she really does. It is conceivable, because where the key decision would be going back to the proposed introduction of universal suffrage. Beijing under Xi put such a tight grip on that essentially Hong Kong people, well, you can have universal suffrage as long as we can choose the candidates. So I think by that stage, the transcript was written pretty much and there was a white paper written at the time that seemed to suggest that Beijing has comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong using that language. So yeah, by then it may be too late. But surely Xi's got his fingerprints over this kind of crackdown. Now, Hong Kong is just another city. Quite frankly, Beijing won't have that either. Hong Kong is this place where nearly 60% of their foreign direct investment passes through it. And when the foreign direct, that's the outbound one, nearly 70% inbound. So China wanted Hong Kong to be different. So on a sort of political level, that's not the case. But I think in a way, it's hard for Hong Kong to just be another city, because the other cities don't have a history of such resistance to Beijing. Hong Kong is more comparable to Xinjiang or Tibet in that regard, that there's this heavy crackdown on voices of opposition that exist there.
Is that still true, or have they been cowed?
Well, yeah, I mean, they just sent 45 of them to jail for having spoke out. So the message is clear. So it's a different society. But I think when you look at it from the Hong Kong side, you're talking about maybe one of the most unusual authoritarian crackdowns in the world, where a totally open society, we're ranked among the most open in the world, with a rule of law among the highest in the world, is then subject to hardline authoritarianism. So what the legal part I was talking about, the architecture in the beginning, I always lead with that, because I need people to understand just how comprehensive it is. And of course, for Chow Hung Tong's notion of warning, if you're in a society that's liberal and open, and people are proposing, you know, populist leaders are said to do, you know, illiberal agendas, then what does it look like? These are the moving parts that change that order. So I think it's quite hard to put the genie back in the bottle in a way. You have a very open society, and now you want to make it a closed society. So they're still half-assing this. I mean, they still allow international internet and other things there. So it's not fully shut down. It's just silenced. through intimidation. So I'm not sure if it works as just an ordinary city, and what is the consequence given its very important role in international finance for China, this foreign direct investment going both ways. There's no city in China that's trusted to do that. And the cost of what they're doing could be to lose that trust in Hong Kong. Whether it will then become just another city in China when it no longer has a trusted rule of law, or trusted access to public information for international business and finance to function, schools with liberal education for people to send their kids if they base them in Hong Kong for the purposes just discussed. There's so many pieces, so many conditions that make Hong Kong unique. And that, I think, is the story. So people might say, well, it's not as bad here as it is in North Korea or Syria or whatever, but they were never a Hong Kong. They were never this dramatically open society that actually, as Chow suggests, offers a warning for the world when it comes to, in this age of democratic retreat, what will be the price of that? So there's lessons out of Hong Kong for the world at large. There's lessons in how we look at China's policy. There's lessons for doing business and finance, the cost of a crackdown. What will it be? We know the economy is in a bit of trouble now. I follow the news in Hong Kong every day. The government likes to blame everything on COVID, but most of these problems are caused by the political moves that they've made. And they try to dodge that bullet. So there's just too many moving parts. And I think so much interest of that, nearly 70% of FDI moving through Hong Kong into China, about a quarter of it, or maybe it's close to a third, I guess about a quarter to a third, is US. So the US has a real interest. Hong Kong is a central part of US trade with China. As was mentioned earlier by Shihoko, the world, or maybe Kelly, one of you mentioned it, that the world was asked to rely on this. So there's even China's reputation for reliability is at stake in Hong Kong. So there's a lot going on.
So these are all reasons, almost all reasons, why it's in China's interest to maintain a veneer of uniqueness. Why is it in our interest to go along with that, rather than to count FDI, count trade, everything for China inclusive, and to have a complete picture, given that China holds the cards, they control the fantasy of uniqueness, they can manipulate it as they wish. I mean, after all, we have an England policy, we don't have a London and a Manchester policy. These other cities are distinct.
Right.
Why is it in our interest to continue to go along with this?
Well, not to go along with what's happening now. Actually, we should be pushing back against the way Beijing has cracked down in Hong Kong, which we are. The United States has spoken out on this. Our Congress is enacting laws on this. There is a pushback. The way Hong Kong was up until 2019 was in our interest. That's a great trade with China is important to the U.S. Importing goods that are less costly is important to the U.S. All the stuff passing through Hong Kong. The fact that Hong Kong had a reliable rule of law really mattered in comparison with Shanghai. A stock market that could be counted on under the principles of the rule of law with accounting procedures and everything that are open and visible so people can make investments there. There's just so much that Hong Kong was so important, but it is under these conditions being degraded in that role. And so the need to push back, in effect, well, we were asked first to rely on it, the deal, Sino-British Treaty and the Basic Law, and people did, the United States did, it passed a Hong Kong Policy Act, all these things, and other countries did. And now we don't have confidence in that. And if China wants our confidence to continue investments in China, Hong Kong is one moving part, perhaps not as risky for the Chinese Communist Party as the whole country, to move towards liberal reform and democracy and so on. So there's a lot again, there's a lot at stake. And this is a central concern of US policy. I'm trying to remember if China is, I think, the United States' leading trading partner. If not the leading one, it's right there close. Yeah. So that I think is in the US interest to keep the guarantees that were made in Hong Kong in place. So that's important.
If I can follow up on that, you have a chapter entitled International Support for Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to give us some of your arguments, what kind of support there was, what opportunities were missed. And then finally, what are the lessons learned? You're talking about the need to push back, to roll back, and go back to how Hong Kong used to be. Then what can we do as an international community and the United States in particular to make sure that that actually is the way forward?
Well, I've already mentioned that in Congress, a number of bills and stuff were passed to encourage monitoring of Hong Kong. And the Human Rights and Democracy Act ultimately resulted in Pompeo declaring that Hong Kong is no longer conforming the Chinese government is no longer conforming to its commitments in Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong's spatial status, in a sense, got degraded. Some of it's still there, but the key parts of it are no longer treated as separate from China. So those things are happening, and I think there was an initial effort to address the problem of Hong Kong immigrants in exiles and stuff, and address their problems. And I think that remains a problem. The United States has this sort of 2016 Global Magnitsky Act, which allows for sanctions. Now, in my view, sanctions don't push the needle that much, but they do reflect an expression of concern and outrage, at least. I don't see China giving in to the sanctions no more than we do to the ones, our officials that they've targeted. In fact, we're going to perhaps have one of them as Secretary of State pretty soon. So that kind of Magnitsky approach, I think, is important, but not enough. In the Treasury Department, we know the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or so-called OFAC, also can target and penalize actions that they want to challenge. In effect, there's some ability to control access to U.S. markets. So there are these tools in our hand, but I think they're kind of a messy lot. I think a more important tool would be where private actions can be more substantial. The U.S. has something called the Alien Tort Statute that allows for private action, but it's been cut back quite a bit. It comes under one of the oldest laws in the United States, the Judiciary Act of 1789. So I think there's room for updating these laws and deciding. We have laws, so-called RICO, that allows suits and private actions when corruption is involved. Can we do that with human rights? How would we do that? What kind of legislation? So at a general level, there's a response that goes beyond Hong Kong. But when it comes to Hong Kong, I think it's important to do certain things. One is address that immigration problem. I mean, make sure that Hong Kongers who are in exile and can't go back are secure in the United States and can become citizens and permanent residents and so on, to protect them. And I actually would suggest, and even Donald Trump has suggested, that he's going to ask for Jimmy Lai's release. So this newspaper publisher in Hong Kong that's now on trial and threatened with life in prison, the U.S. has historically negotiated with China and Russia and others over releases. I think the 45 and Jimmy Lai would certainly should come at the top of the list. So there are things like that can be done. Permanent resident technology, we're working on some of that. We're restricting some technology. There's a lot to do. We know this is a very sensitive issue at the moment. So there are things that are directly involving Hong Kong. Like I mentioned, the foreign direct investment passes through there. There can be for Chinese companies in the United States and for American companies in Hong Kong, their human rights behavior or their complicity. We did that with Xinjiang. We target companies that are producing goods in Xinjiang. So I think these kinds of things might be also worth exploring. So there are a number of strategies. I think Hong Kong is a core US interest. It won't continue to be if its rule of law and everything is no longer reliable, but it has been up until now a very important US interest in Asia. So I think these are things that we can address. I think exposing human rights is the job. It's something that has to be done if we're going to pursue our interest in Asia. And this is Hong Kong is a case that needs attention.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I know that we could continue this conversation, but I would like to actually conclude our discussion today with those words of cautious optimism from you. And again, congratulations on a really great book. We will actually have a link to this publication on our website as well. In the meantime, I would like to thank Professor Kellee Tsai of Northeastern University, as well as Robert Daly of the Kissinger Institute for joining us today. Thank you, and I hope we can have you back again, Michael.
Very good. I always appreciate the Wilson Center. I'm one of your fellows, and I hope to continue doing this kind of work. Thank you.